She was invisible, not because she wanted to be, but because those around her never saw the heart behind her hands. They laughed at her street-style food, called it humble, crude, beneath their polished taste. But what the millionaire's son said afterward, that froze everyone. The silence after his words echoed louder than any insult ever could. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cooking dinner for someone who never says thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will move you. Let me take you to San Francisco, to a sprawling mansion perched on Pacific Heights, where the morning fog rolls in from the bay like a whispered prayer. The kitchen gleamed with copper pots that caught the early light, stainless steel appliances worth more than most people's cars, and marble countertops that stretched like frozen rivers. Yet for all its grandeur, it felt cold, lacking the warmth that only love can kindle. Here, every sunrise found Rosa Martinez already at work, the gentle glow of the oven her only company before the household stirred. At 57, Rosa's hands bore the maps of countless meals, small scars from hurried knives, calluses from kneading dough, fingers that moved with the precision of a concert pianist across cutting boards worn smooth by decades of devotion. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was always pulled back in a simple bun, and her apron, a faded blue one she'd brought from her tiny apartment in the Mission District, was her uniform of choice, not the starched white coats the previous cooks had worn. Rosa's cooking was a love letter written in smoke and spice. She carried the soul of her neighborhood, the sizzle of carne asada from 24th Street, the earthy warmth of fresh masa from La Palma Tortilleria, the complex depth of mole that took 3 days to perfect. Her food spoke of celebrations in cramped apartments where 20 people somehow fit around tables meant for 6, of quinceañeras where the whole block danced until dawn, of Sunday mornings when the smell of menudo could cure both hangovers and heartbreak. But in this house of crystal chandeliers and imported silverware, her food was dismissed as ethnic, too spicy, street food, unworthy of refined palates. The mansion belonged to Richard Caldwell, whose restaurant empire had made him one of San Francisco's wealthiest men. His Michelin-starred establishments dotted the city like gleaming jewels, each one a temple to molecular gastronomy and ingredients flown in from distant continents. His net worth, estimated at over $200 million, included real estate investments across California, a portfolio of tech stocks that had multiplied during Silicon Valley's boom years, and even a modest holding in Bitcoin that his financial advisor had recommended as a hedge against inflation. Richard's world smelled of truffle oil and sterile precision, but never of the rosemary that Rosa rubbed between her palms to release its pine-sharp fragrance, never of the dried chilies she toasted until they released their smoky secrets. His dining experiences were performances, orchestrated affairs where presentation mattered more than nourishment, where the distance between chef and diner was measured in both feet and philosophy. Rosa had been working in this mansion for 15 years, arriving each morning at 5:30 when the city still slept, leaving after sunset when the family's dinner dishes gleamed in the dishwasher. She was a steady pulse in the background, never rising above the shadow of the empire, never acknowledged in the dinner party conversations that praised Richard's culinary vision. Her own culinary journey had begun not in culinary schools or prestigious kitchens, but in her grandmother's cramped kitchen in Guadalajara, where she learned that cooking wasn't just about feeding bodies. It was about feeding souls. The morning fog clung to the mansion's windows as Rosa moved through her morning ritual. She checked the sourdough starter she'd been nurturing for years, its earthy scent filling her nostrils with comfort. The cast-iron comal, blackened from thousands of tortillas, heated slowly on the stove, the one piece of equipment she'd been allowed to keep when Richard renovated the kitchen with $15,000 worth of German appliances. Her movements were a meditation, each gesture purposeful and graceful, like a dancer who had rehearsed these steps until they became breathing. The house above her was beginning to stir. Eleanor Caldwell's heels clicked against marble floors as she made her way to the breakfast nook, her voice already sharp with the day's first complaints. The three Caldwell children, Margaret, 25 and working at her father's restaurant group, James, 23 and fresh from his MBA program, and Samuel, 21, and recently returned from UC Berkeley, moved through their morning routines with the casual entitlement of those who had never known want. Rosa began preparing breakfast, her hands working without conscious thought. Fresh orange juice, not from concentrate but from Valencia oranges she'd selected herself at the Ferry Building market. Steel-cut oats that she'd cook slowly, stirring clockwise because her grandmother had taught her it made the porridge creamier. Free-range eggs from a farm in Sonoma where she knew the chickens had names. Each ingredient chosen with care, each dish prepared with intention, though she knew Eleanor would barely glance up from her phone to acknowledge the meal. But as Rosa worked, her mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard the night before. Richard had been on a call with his restaurant managers, discussing the acquisition of another property, a deal worth several $1 million. Location, 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 he had laughed into his phone. Buy low, renovate smart, and watch the property values soar. That's how you build real wealth. The irony wasn't lost on Rosa, a man who bought and sold restaurants like chess pieces, yet couldn't recognize the value of the woman who had been nourishing his family for a decade and a half. The kitchen filled with the scent of fresh coffee beans, imported from a single-origin farm in Guatemala, the kind of detail Richard appreciated when it came to his business, but overlooked when Rosa tried to explain why she sourced her spices from specific vendors in the Mission. She ground the beans by hand, listening to the mechanical hum of the house waking up, the gentle whoosh of the heated floors, the distant sound of showers running, the electronic beep of the security system being disarmed. This was her domain, these pre-dawn hours when the kitchen belonged to her alone. Soon the space would fill with the chaos of family breakfast, the rush of schedules and demands, the casual dismissal of her efforts. But for now, in this quiet moment before the storm, Rosa allowed herself to remember why she cooked, not for recognition or praise, but because feeding people was the most honest way she knew to say, "I love you," even when that love went unnoticed. The fog outside was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the bay where container ships moved like floating cities, carrying goods worth millions across the Pacific. Rosa watched them for a moment, thinking of her own journey from the small town where her grandmother had taught her to make tortillas by touch alone, to this gleaming kitchen where her heritage was seen as something to be overcome rather than celebrated. Rosa's journey to the Caldwell mansion began 18 years ago, not with grand ambitions but with desperate necessity. She had arrived in San Francisco after her husband Miguel's death in a construction accident, carrying nothing but a battered suitcase, her grandmother's molcajete wrapped in old towels, and the phone number of her cousin Maria, who worked as a housekeeper in Pacific Heights. The city's steep hills had seemed insurmountable then, both literally and metaphorically, as she climbed through neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the faces grew whiter with each upward step. The help-wanted advertisement had been tucked between luxury car listings and exclusive private school announcements in the Pacific Heights Community Bulletin Board. Domestic help needed for prominent family. Discretion and reliability essential, it read, listing a salary that was life-changing money for Rosa. She'd applied knowing she was underqualified, her English still heavily accented, her experience limited to caring for her own family and helping out at her church's community dinners. Richard Caldwell had barely looked at her during that first interview, treating the hiring as just another business transaction to be delegated to his wife, Eleanor. Rosa remembered sitting in the formal living room, her hands folded in her lap, while Eleanor questioned her about references and availability, as if she were interviewing for a position at a bank rather than asking her to care for a family's most intimate needs. The job was for cleaning and basic kitchen assistance. The Caldwells employed a trained chef from the Culinary Institute of America for their actual meals. But Rosa had a secret weapon that her resume couldn't capture, an instinctive understanding that a house needed more than cleaning to become a home. During her first months, while dusting the endless shelves of leather-bound books that no one read and polishing silverware that was used only for status, she began to notice things. Margaret struggling with college applications at the dining room table, stress written in the way she chewed her pen. James practicing presentations for his business classes, his confidence wavering when he thought no one was watching. Samuel, then only 15, often sitting alone in the breakfast nook, looking lost in his own house. It started small. During her afternoon break, Rosa would prepare simple snacks for herself. Quesadillas made with cheese she bought at the Mexican market, refried beans that actually tasted like beans instead of the bland canned version the family chef used, agua fresca made with fresh fruit and mint. She grew in a small pot on the kitchen windowsill. The children began appearing during these informal meals, drawn by aromas that actually awakened their appetites instead of satisfying them as a mere formality. Margaret was the first to venture close. "What is that smell?" she had asked one afternoon, finding Rosa preparing fresh salsas with tomatoes, onions, and cilantro. Rosa had explained each ingredient, letting Margaret taste the individual components before combining them, teaching her that cooking wasn't magic, but patience and understanding. Soon, Margaret was spending her study breaks in the kitchen, and Rosa noticed her grades improving as her stress levels decreased. James followed next, initially skeptical, but gradually won over by Rosa's tamales, masa he could actually taste instead of the flavorless starch he was used to, pork shoulder that had been slow-cooked with dried chilies until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. "How do you make meat taste like this?" he had asked, and Rosa had smiled, explaining about marinades that required time, about the importance of browning the meat properly, about how the best cooking couldn't be rushed. But it was Samuel who became her true student. Even as a teenager, he possessed an intuitive understanding of how food could be both nourishment and communication. He would sit at the kitchen counter doing homework while Rosa prepared dinner, asking questions not just about techniques, but about the stories behind the dishes. "Why do you add chocolate to the mole?" he had asked, and Rosa had told him about her great-grandmother, who discovered that a small piece of dark chocolate could balance the heat of the chilies and create depth that no cookbook could teach. The transformation happened gradually, so subtly that even Rosa didn't notice at first. The Caldwell children began requesting her food specifically, asking her to pack lunches for them instead of giving them money for the school cafeteria. They started bringing friends home for study sessions, knowing that Rosa would have fresh tortillas and homemade guacamole waiting. The kitchen, once sterile and formal, began to feel alive with laughter and conversation. When the original chef left abruptly, a disagreement over creative control that Rosa only understood in fragments, Richard faced a dilemma. His wife's dinner parties were legendary in their social circle, carefully orchestrated affairs that required someone who understood both classical techniques and the sophisticated palate of San Francisco's elite. Rosa had never applied for the position, had never asked for the promotion. She was simply there, reliable and capable, when desperation demanded an immediate solution. "Can you handle dinner for 12 people this Friday?" Richard had asked, his tone suggesting he expected the answer to be no. But Rosa had nodded, already mentally planning a menu that would honor her own heritage while respecting the family's social expectations. She prepared chiles rellenos using the finest cheese Richard's money could buy, but stuffed them with a mixture that included her grandmother's secret blend of herbs. She made mole poblano from scratch, grinding her own spices, but served it alongside perfectly cooked beef tenderloin instead of the traditional turkey. That night, watching through the kitchen service window as Richard's guests savored every bite, asking for seconds and complimenting the complex flavors, Rosa felt a pride she'd never experienced in all her years of following other people's menus. She had found a way to be herself within the constraints of her position, to honor her heritage while serving her employer's needs. Margaret had smuggled a plate into the kitchen afterward, insisting Rosa taste her own cooking, served on the family's finest china. "You should see their faces," she'd whispered conspiratorially. Mother's friends are already asking for your recipes. For the first time in years, Rosa felt visible, valued, seen for the artist she had always known herself to be. But the promotion came without acknowledgement, without ceremony, without even a conversation about her new responsibilities or compensation. Richard simply added meal preparation to her duties while keeping her official title as domestic staff. Her salary increased modestly, enough to move from her studio apartment in the Mission to a small one-bedroom, enough to send money to her sister in Mexico, but not enough to reflect the true value she brought to the family's daily life. She became the keeper of the family's rhythms, learning each person's preferences and adapting accordingly. Eleanor preferred her coffee strong, but her flavors mild, a contradiction Rosa navigated by serving sophisticated dishes with subtle heat. Richard respected precision and presentation, so Rosa learned to plate her street food with the visual elegance of his restaurant empire. The children simply wanted authenticity, flavors that told stories instead of merely filling stomachs. For 15 years, she had been the silent orchestrator of the Caldwell family's happiness, creating memories one meal at a time, never asking for credit or recognition, finding satisfaction in the empty plates and satisfied sighs that were her only feedback. She had watched the children grow from teenagers to adults, had cooked their birthday cakes and graduation dinners, had prepared comfort food during heartbreaks and celebration feasts during triumphs. Yet she remained invisible in their success stories, unmentioned in their gratitude, absent from the family photographs that documented their shared history. She was the ghost in their machine, essential but unacknowledged, like the electricity that powered their lights or the water that filled their pipes, necessary, reliable, and completely taken for granted. The daily disrespect arrived like morning fog, so gradual and persistent that it became part of the landscape, unnoticed until it had completely obscured the view. Rosa experienced it in 1,000 small cuts, each one alone seeming insignificant, but together creating a wound that never quite healed. Eleanor Caldwell specialized in the art of diminishment disguised as casual conversation. Rosa makes adequate tortillas, she would tell her dinner guests while Rosa served the handmade corn tortillas that had taken her 2 hours to prepare from scratch, though of course they're nothing like what you'd get at a proper restaurant. The word adequate hung in the air like smoke, reducing hours of skilled labor to mere competence, dismissing Rosa's expertise as if she were a kitchen appliance that functioned satisfactorily but without distinction. During Eleanor's weekly bridge parties, Rosa would prepare elaborate appetizer spreads, delicate empanadas with paper-thin pastry, ceviche that required precise timing to cure the fish properly, tamales wrapped in corn husks she had to drive to 3 different markets to find. The ladies would devour every morsel while discussing their latest charitable endeavors and vacation plans, never once acknowledging Rosa's presence as she refilled their water glasses and cleared their plates. "I don't know where Eleanor finds these people," one of the women had remarked, speaking about Rosa as if she were deaf rather than simply serving silently. "I suppose they work cheaply, but honestly, this spicy food is so ethnic. My digestive system simply wasn't designed for all these peppers." Meanwhile, the woman reached for her 3rd helping of Rosa's chile poblano dip, her actions contradicting her words with every bite. Rosa's signature dishes became those Mexican things in the family's vocabulary, a designation that erased both their complexity and her skill in creating them. Her mole, which required 37 ingredients and 3 days of preparation, a recipe passed down through 4 generations of her family, was referred to as that brown sauce Rosa makes. The casual dismissal stung more than overt insults would have, because it revealed how completely her artistry had been reduced to fuel, her heritage to convenience. Richard's disrespect was more subtle but equally corrosive. He would critique her presentations with the same tone he used to discuss underperforming restaurant locations, treating her cooking as a product to be optimized rather than an expression to be appreciated. "The plating needs work," he'd comment, standing over her shoulder as she prepared dinner. "In my restaurants, we understand that people eat with their eyes first. This looks too rustic." The word rustic became his favorite euphemism for everything he found unsophisticated about her cooking. Her handmade tortillas were inconsistently rustic. Her slow-braised carnitas, meat so tender it could be cut with a fork, was rustic but lacking refinement. Even her carefully composed plates, which she had learned to arrange with the precision of a jeweler, were dismissed as competent in a rustic way. During business dinners at the mansion, Rosa would prepare elaborate multi-course meals that showcased her versatility. French techniques applied to Mexican ingredients, familiar flavors elevated through careful presentation, and premium ingredients that Richard's wealth made possible. She had taught herself classical mother sauces, studied Jacques Pepin's cookbooks during her rare free evenings, practiced knife cuts until her brunoise was as precise as any culinary school graduate's. But when Richard introduced the meals to his business associates, he would apologize for them. "Our cook prepares what she calls elevated Mexican cuisine," he'd say with a slight smile that suggested everyone was in on the same joke. "It's not quite what you'd find at Le Bernardin, but it has its own charm." Rosa, serving the meal she had spent 8 hours preparing, would feel her face burn with humiliation while maintaining the neutral expression that years of domestic work had taught her to perfect. The casual cruelties accumulated like interest on unpaid debt, compounding daily until the weight became almost unbearable. Margaret, now working in her father's restaurant empire, would bring colleagues home for dinner and then spend the meal explaining why her family's food was authentic, but obviously not restaurant quality. James, after completing his MBA, began offering unsolicited business advice about how Rosa could scale up her recipes for commercial production, as if her grandmother's carefully guarded secrets were just another commodity to be monetized. Even the household staff, taking cues from their employers, began treating Rosa with casual condescension. The cleaning service would rearrange her kitchen tools, moving her carefully organized spice collection, and acting surprised when she asked them to leave her station alone. "It's just cooking stuff," the head cleaner had shrugged, unable to understand that each jar and knife held the accumulated wisdom of decades. The new delivery drivers, unfamiliar with Rosa's routine, would hand grocery orders to Eleanor instead of bringing them directly to the kitchen. Eleanor would then present the ingredients to Rosa as if she were doing her a favor, often commenting on the cost of specialty items Rosa had specifically requested. "$40 for these peppers?" she'd ask, holding up the package of dried chilies that would transform into the complex base for Rosa's famous mole. "I suppose when you're not spending your own money, everything seems reasonable." During holiday preparations, when Rosa worked 16-hour days to create the elaborate meals that Eleanor's extended family expected, the exhaustion would settle into her bones like rain into thirsty earth. She would arrive before dawn to begin preparations that would continue past midnight, hand-forming hundreds of tamales, slowly simmering stocks that would become the foundation for multiple dishes, kneading bread dough between her fingers until it achieved the perfect texture her grandmother had taught her to recognize by touch alone. Yet when the extended family gathered, praising the feast and asking for recipes, Eleanor would smile graciously and accept the compliments as if she had orchestrated the miracle herself. "Oh, you know how it is during the holidays," she'd laugh. "Everything is just so hectic trying to manage it all." Rosa would watch from the kitchen doorway, invisible in her exhaustion, as Eleanor basked in appreciation for work she had never touched, for artistry she couldn't begin to comprehend. The accumulation of these moments created a peculiar form of emotional whiplash. Rosa's days were filled with the deep satisfaction of creating beauty from simple ingredients, the meditative pleasure of techniques perfected over decades, the joy of watching people's faces light up when they tasted her food. But those moments of professional pride were constantly undercut by reminders that her employers saw her as interchangeable, replaceable, valuable only for her reliability rather than her irreplaceable skill. She began to guard her heart more carefully, finding solace in the early morning hours when the kitchen belonged to her alone, when she could work without commentary or criticism, when her hands could speak the language they had always known without translation or apology. But even in those precious moments of solitude, she could feel the weight of invisibility settling around her shoulders, like a cloak she could never quite remove. But Samuel was different. Even as a child, he had possessed an intuitive understanding that food was more than fuel, that the kitchen held secrets his formal education couldn't teach. While his siblings rushed through meals to return to their screens and schedules, Samuel would linger at the kitchen counter, asking Rosa about the stories behind her dishes, the memories embedded in her recipes. The connection began during his high school years, when teenage growing pains sent him searching for comfort food that actually provided comfort. Rosa's kitchen became his refuge from the pressure of private school expectations and his father's assumption that he would seamlessly transition into the family business empire. In a house where every conversation seemed to carry the weight of performance and achievement, Rosa's domain offered something different: acceptance without judgment, nourishment without conditions. Samuel would arrive in the kitchen most afternoons, backpack heavy with AP textbooks and college preparation materials, and Rosa would wordlessly provide whatever he needed. Sometimes it was still warm chocolate chip cookies that reminded him he was still a child, despite his family's adult expectations. Sometimes it was a bowl of her gentle chicken soup, the broth golden with saffron and rich with the kind of patience that couldn't be purchased with all his father's wealth. Sometimes it was simply her presence, steady and reassuring while he struggled through calculus homework or wrestled with college essay prompts. Over time, their relationship evolved from simple comfort to genuine mentorship. Samuel began asking questions that revealed his growing sophistication about food and culture. "Why do you add orange zest to your mole?" he'd inquire, and Rosa would explain about balance, how the citrus brightness lifted the earthy darkness of the chocolate and chilies, creating complexity that kept people interested rather than simply satisfied. She taught him that great cooking wasn't about following recipes, but about understanding relationships, how salt enhances sweetness, how acid cuts richness, how time transforms tough meat into silk. During his senior year, when college applications demanded essays about meaningful influences, Samuel spent hours at the kitchen counter interviewing Rosa about her culinary philosophy. He learned that she had never owned a cookbook until she began working for his family, that her knowledge came from watching her grandmother's hands, from tasting and adjusting, from understanding that cooking was essentially problem-solving with your senses as guide. "My grandmother could tell when bread was properly kneaded just by touching it," Rosa told him one evening while teaching him to make fresh pasta. "Not by timing it or counting folds, but by how the dough felt under her fingers. She said cooking wasn't in your head. It was in your hands and heart." Samuel had tried to replicate the feeling Rosa described, pressing his inexperienced fingers into the dough while she guided his movements, beginning to understand that mastery couldn't be rushed or bought. When Samuel left for UC Berkeley, Rosa felt the absence keenly. The kitchen seemed too quiet during afternoon hours that had been filled with his questions and laughter. But he returned during holidays with new stories and perspectives, having discovered restaurants and food cultures that expanded his understanding of what Rosa had been teaching him all along. He would bring her salt from Hawaii with its distinctive mineral taste, or olive oil from small California producers, eager to share discoveries with the woman who had awakened his palate to possibility. Their conversations during those college visits revealed Samuel's growing awareness of the inequity in his own household. He began noticing how his mother's friends praised meals without acknowledging Rosa's presence, how his father discussed restaurant quality without recognizing the artistry happening in his own kitchen. The casual disregard that Rosa had endured for years became visible to Samuel's maturing eyes, and his discomfort grew alongside his appreciation for her skill. "It's not fair how they treat you," he said one evening during his junior year, finding Rosa in the kitchen at midnight, preparing dough for the next day's bread. She had smiled sadly and continued kneading, her hands moving in the rhythm she had learned 40 years earlier in her grandmother's kitchen. "Fairness is a luxury, mijo," she had replied, using the endearment that came naturally despite their employer-employee relationship. "I'm not here for fairness. I'm here to feed people, and when people are fed with love, something good comes from that, even if they never say thank you." But Samuel was no longer satisfied with that acceptance. His college courses in sociology and cultural studies had given him vocabulary for concepts he had sensed but couldn't articulate. Cultural appropriation, immigrant labor exploitation, the way genuine artisanship was devalued when it came from working-class hands. He began seeing his family's treatment of Rosa not as benign neglect, but as active discrimination, a reflection of broader systems that allowed people like his parents to benefit from skills they neither possessed nor properly compensated. During his final semester, Samuel convinced Rosa to let him document some of her recipes, ostensibly for a cultural anthropology project, but actually because he feared losing access to her knowledge when he graduated and moved away. They spent hours together, Rosa demonstrating techniques while Samuel took careful notes, trying to capture not just ingredients and measurements, but also the intuitive adjustments she made based on humidity, altitude, the quality of particular ingredients. "You can't really write down how to make mole," Rosa explained while toasting dried peppers over an open flame, turning them carefully to achieve even charring without burning. "Every batch is a conversation between you and the ingredients. The peppers tell you when they're ready, the chocolate tells you when it's enough, the meat tells you when it's tender. You have to listen, not just follow directions." Samuel tried to transcribe that wisdom, knowing that his notes could never fully capture the knowledge Rosa carried in her hands and heart. But the process revealed the depth of her expertise, the years of experimentation and refinement that had gone into mastering techniques that looked effortless when she performed them. He began to understand that what his family dismissed as simple cooking was actually sophisticated culinary artistry, informed by generations of accumulated knowledge. Their final conversation before his graduation was both celebration and lament. Samuel had secured a position at a prestigious San Francisco restaurant, his degree and family connections opening doors that remained closed to cooks like Rosa despite her superior skill. They both understood the irony. He would be starting his career in kitchens where her experience would make her invaluable, but her lack of formal credentials would likely keep her forever invisible. "Promise me something," Samuel had said as Rosa packed containers of his favorite foods for his new apartment. "Promise me you'll never let them make you feel small. What you do here, what you've taught me, it's not just cooking. It's keeping culture alive. It's making love visible. It's doing something most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out." Rosa had nodded, touched by his recognition, but knowing that promises couldn't protect her from the daily erosions of dignity that came with her position. After graduation, Samuel's visits became less frequent as his restaurant career demanded increasingly long hours. But Rosa treasured their occasional phone calls and the photographs he would send from his professional kitchen, showing techniques he had learned from watching her hands, dishes that bore the subtle influence of her teaching. In a family that saw her as replaceable help, Samuel alone recognized her as irreplaceable teacher, the keeper of knowledge that couldn't be purchased or credentialed, only earned through decades of patient practice and generous sharing. The challenge arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, wrapped in the false courtesy that wealthy people use to deliver devastating news. Richard appeared in the kitchen during Rosa's morning prep, his presence unusual enough to make her hands pause in their automatic rhythm of chopping onions for the day's sofrito. Behind him stood a woman Rosa had never seen before, tall, blonde, expensively dressed in chef's whites that were so pristine they practically gleamed under the kitchen's recessed lighting. "Rosa, I'd like you to meet Chef Madison Pierce," Richard announced with the kind of forced enthusiasm he typically reserved for restaurant investors or city council members whose approval he needed. "Madison comes to us from Daniel Boulud's kitchen in New York, and she'll be taking over our meal preparation and menu planning going forward." The words landed like physical blows, each one calculated to minimize Rosa's 15 years of service while maximizing the newcomer's credentials. Chef Madison Pierce, not just Madison, but Chef Madison Pierce, extended a manicured hand that had clearly never spent decades gripping knife handles or kneading bread dough until her knuckles ached. Her smile was professionally warm, but her eyes were already cataloging the kitchen, mentally rearranging Rosa's carefully organized workspace to suit her own preferences. "I've heard wonderful things about your contributions to the household," Madison said, her pause before contributions loaded with the kind of polite dismissal that Rosa had learned to recognize after years in service. "I'm sure we can find ways for you to continue supporting the family's needs in other capacities." Other capacities. The euphemism hung in the air like the scent of burned garlic, impossible to ignore and unpleasant to acknowledge directly. Rosa understood immediately that she was being demoted, relegated from chef to cleaning staff, from artisan to invisible laborer. Her grandmother's molcajete, worn smooth by generations of grinding spices, would be replaced by Madison's expensive food processor. Her cast-iron comal, seasoned to perfection over years of patient care, would be pushed aside for Madison's collection of French copper pans. Richard was already explaining the transition timeline, discussing Madison's plans to modernize the menu with contemporary American cuisine that would better reflect his restaurant empire's sophisticated brand. Rosa heard fragments through the roaring in her ears: molecular gastronomy, locally sourced ingredients, Instagram-worthy presentations. Everything she had learned about feeding people with love and intention was being dismissed as outdated, unsophisticated, inadequate for the family's evolving tastes. "Of course, we'll still need Rosa's help with basic prep work," Madison was saying, already establishing the hierarchy that would govern their working relationship. "Chopping vegetables, cleaning equipment, maintaining inventory. I understand she's been quite reliable in those areas." Rosa's artistry was being reduced to manual labor, her expertise dismissed as mere reliability, as if anyone with working hands could do what she did. The first weeks of the transition were a masterclass in professional humiliation. Madison installed herself in Rosa's kitchen like a conquering general, immediately rearranging everything to suit her classically trained sensibilities. Rosa's spice collection, organized according to the flavor profiles she had developed over decades, was consolidated into a single cabinet to make room for Madison's molecular gastronomy equipment. Her treasured knives, each one hand-selected and perfectly balanced for her grip, were moved to a drawer, while Madison's Japanese steel claimed the magnetic strip on the wall. Madison's cooking was technically proficient but emotionally sterile, the kind of food that impressed dinner guests with its visual sophistication, but left them somehow unsatisfied, despite having consumed adequate calories. Her signature dish was a deconstructed Mexican street corn silk paper filled with corn essence, topped with cottage snow and chili dust applied with precision tweezers. It was beautiful, innovative, and completely soulless, lacking any connection to the comforting simplicity of actual elote sold from carts in Rosa's neighborhood. Rosa watched Madison work with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching accidents unfold in slow motion. Every technique was performed with showmanship rather than efficiency, every ingredient treated as a component in a scientific experiment rather than a gift to be honored. Madison would consult her iPhone for measurements that Rosa carried in muscle memory, would time every step with digital precision, while Rosa had learned to trust her senses to indicate doneness. The family's reactions provided their own form of torture. Eleanor immediately embraced Madison's sophisticated presentations, praising elaborate compositions that took hours to construct and minutes to consume. Finally, we have restaurant-quality food at home, she announced to her bridge club, as if Rosa's years of feeding her family had been some sort of culinary trial they had endured with admirable patience. Margaret and James, eager to align themselves with their parents' preferences, echoed the enthusiasm with comments about how the new menus were so much more refined and really elevated. Only Samuel, visiting during a brief break from his own restaurant career, seemed to notice something missing from the household's new culinary direction. Rosa caught him in the kitchen late one evening, standing in front of the refrigerator with a confused expression, opening and closing the door as if the right food might materialize through persistence. "There's nothing to eat," he said when he noticed Rosa cleaning nearby counters, and she understood exactly what he meant. Madison's elaborate creations might satisfy hunger, but they didn't feed the deeper need for comfort, for connection, for the sense that someone cared enough to nourish not just your body, but your soul. The kitchen that had once smelled like home now smelled like a laboratory, antiseptic and precise, but lacking any warmth. Rosa found herself relegated to dishes she could perform without thinking, washing vegetables until her hands were raw from cold water, scrubbing pots after Madison's elaborate presentations, organizing inventory with the methodical precision of someone whose expertise was no longer valued for its creativity. She was allowed to prepare simple staff meals during her break, but Madison had made it clear that Rosa's ethnic specialties were not appropriate for the family's refined palates. The final insult came during Richard's birthday celebration, when Madison prepared an elaborate tasting menu that showcased her classical training and contemporary techniques. Rosa spent the day preparing vegetables and cleaning equipment, while Madison orchestrated the multi-course performance, each dish presented with detailed explanations of its inspiration and technique. The guests were appropriately impressed, offering the kind of sophisticated commentary that Madison clearly craved. But Rosa noticed what the guests couldn't see: Richard pushing food around his plate, eating politely but without enthusiasm. Eleanor's forced smile as she complimented presentations that looked like art installations, but tasted like expensive experiments. The children's confused expressions as they encountered familiar flavors, disguised beyond recognition in Madison's interpretation of their childhood favorites. After the guests left and Madison retreated to plan the following week's menus, Rosa found herself alone in the kitchen she had once commanded, washing dishes that bore traces of food that had impressed but not satisfied, that had showcased technique but communicated nothing about love, care, or the simple pleasure of feeding people well. She realized that Madison's sophisticated presentations couldn't replace what she had brought to the family's table: the understanding that food was language, that cooking was love made visible, that the highest compliment a meal could receive wasn't praise, but the quiet satisfaction of completely empty plates. In that moment, washing expensive china while surrounded by equipment she was no longer allowed to use for anything more creative than basic prep work, Rosa felt more invisible than she ever had during her years of being taken for granted. At least then, her food had spoken for her, had created connections and comfort even when her contributions went unacknowledged. Now she was truly silenced, her voice replaced by someone who spoke the language her employers preferred, but couldn't communicate the things they didn't know they were missing. The disaster struck during the most important dinner party of Richard's social calendar, a charity fundraiser for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art that would host 40 of the city's most influential philanthropists, including tech billionaires whose cryptocurrency portfolios alone were worth hundreds of millions, restaurant moguls whose empires rivaled Richard's own, and socialites whose approval could make or break reputations in Pacific Heights society. Madison had spent weeks planning a 7-course molecular gastronomy showcase designed to establish her reputation among San Francisco's culinary elite and demonstrate that the Caldwell household had evolved beyond its previous limitations. The evening began with Madison's characteristic precision, each course timed to arrive at perfectly calculated intervals, each presentation photographed by Eleanor's social media coordinator to document the family's sophisticated progression. Rosa watched from her diminished position, relegated to washing dishes and restocking service items, as Madison orchestrated her culinary performance with the confidence of someone whose formal credentials had never been questioned. The first 5 courses proceeded flawlessly, earning the kind of intellectual appreciation that Madison had sought. Guests discussed the molecular techniques with the same detached enthusiasm they brought to art gallery openings or wine tastings, appreciating the innovation while remaining emotionally unmoved by the food itself. Rosa could see the satisfaction on Madison's face as she heard fragments of praise filtering back from the dining room, comments about extraordinary technique and cutting-edge presentation that validated her decision to relocate from New York. But perfection, Rosa had learned over her decades in professional kitchens, was an illusion that could shatter in an instant. The 6th course, Madison's interpretation of Tiopino featuring precisely controlled seafood proteins suspended in clarified tomato essence, began showing problems almost immediately. The halibut, cooked using Madison's preferred sous vide technique, had been mistimed and emerged gray and rubbery despite the precision of her equipment. The lobster, imported at enormous expense from Maine and treated with liquid nitrogen for textural contrast, had been contaminated during processing and began showing signs of spoilage that Madison's elaborate presentation couldn't disguise. Rosa recognized the signs before Madison did: the slightly off smell, the wrong texture, the way the expensive proteins responded to heat in ways that indicated they were no longer safe to serve. But Madison, committed to her timeline and reputation, chose to proceed rather than acknowledge the failure of her carefully planned menu. She plated the compromised course with her characteristic attention to visual detail, using tweezers to position microgreens and pipettes to add dots of infused oils that would disguise any questionable elements. Within 20 minutes of the 6th course being served, the disaster became undeniable. 3 of Richard's most important guests began showing signs of food poisoning: nausea, sweating, the kind of immediate distress that no amount of social politeness could conceal. The tech mogul, whose blockchain investments had made him one of Silicon Valley's most influential voices, had to excuse himself abruptly, his face pale and hands trembling. Eleanor's closest friend, a socialite whose charity endorsements could influence millions in donations, began sweating visibly despite the mansion's perfectly controlled climate. The room's atmosphere shifted from sophisticated appreciation to barely controlled panic as more guests began experiencing symptoms. Richard, watching his social reputation dissolve in real time, began damage control immediately, calling his personal physician and coordinating medical attention while trying to maintain some semblance of hospitality. Eleanor disappeared into logistics mode, managing transportation for affected guests, while her social media coordinator frantically deleted photographs of the evening's progression. But Madison, faced with the collapse of her carefully constructed professional image, made a choice that would define everything that followed. Instead of accepting responsibility for the culinary disaster she had created, she turned toward Rosa with the calculation of someone desperate to preserve her own reputation at any cost. "I can't believe this happened," Madison announced to the kitchen staff, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the few remaining guests who were gathering their belongings. "I followed my recipes exactly, but someone must have contaminated the ingredients during prep work. Rosa was handling the seafood earlier, and I should have supervised more carefully." The accusation embedded in her statement was clear to anyone listening. The Mexican woman with no formal training had somehow sabotaged the sophisticated menu through carelessness or incompetence. Rosa, still standing at the dish station with hands covered in suds, felt the words hit like physical blows. In 15 years of working for the Caldwell family, she had never once served food that wasn't safe, never once prioritized speed over quality, never once forgotten the fundamental responsibility that came with feeding people. Her grandmother had taught her that cooking for others was sacred work, that every meal carried the possibility of nourishment or harm, and that a cook's first duty was always protection. Richard, desperate for an explanation that wouldn't hold him personally responsible for the evening's catastrophe, seized upon Madison's implication immediately. "Rosa, did you properly wash the seafood when you were doing prep work?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately and completely. The presumption in his tone that Rosa must be responsible for any failure in his perfectly managed household revealed how easily 15 years of faithful service could be erased when convenient scapegoat was needed. "I didn't touch the seafood today," Rosa replied quietly, her English carefully measured despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her voice. Chef Madison kept all proteins locked in her preparation area, but her defense sounded weak even to her own ears, the word of a domestic worker against a professionally trained chef whose credentials spoke louder than Rosa's truth. Madison's story evolved as the evening progressed, becoming more detailed and damaging with each repetition. By the time the last affected guest had been driven home and Richard's damage control efforts were fully engaged, Madison had constructed a narrative in which Rosa's cultural cooking practices had somehow contaminated the professional preparation area, introducing bacteria through unsanitary traditional methods that had compromised the evening's sophisticated menu. The accusation was both racist and professionally devastating, suggesting that Rosa's heritage itself was somehow incompatible with food safety, that her traditional techniques were inherently dangerous when compared to Madison's formal training. It exploited every prejudice that Richard and Eleanor had ever harbored about ethnic food, every assumption about the superiority of expensive culinary education over generations of accumulated knowledge. Rosa stood in the kitchen she had commanded for 15 years, surrounded by the tools of her trade, watching her reputation disappear as completely as if Madison were erasing her from a photograph. The molcajete that her grandmother had passed down, worn smooth by generations of careful use, suddenly appeared unsanitary when compared to Madison's stainless steel equipment. The cast-iron comel that Rosa had seasoned over months of patient care became evidence of outdated cooking methods rather than testament to traditional skill. The final humiliation came when Richard, his face still flushed with embarrassment from the evening's social disaster, made his decision with the swift brutality of someone cutting losses in a failing investment. "Rosa, I think it's best if you clean out your things tonight," he said, not meeting her eyes, treating the termination of 15 years of service as if it were a routine business transaction rather than the destruction of a woman's livelihood and dignity. She removed her apron for the last time in that kitchen, the faded blue fabric that had protected her clothes through thousands of meals, hundreds of celebrations, countless quiet mornings when she had been the first person awake in the house and the last to leave at night. Her hands shook as she untied the strings that had become as familiar as her own clothing, as she folded the apron that had been her uniform and her armor through years of invisible service. Rosa gathered her personal items, the knife roll that contained tools she had selected and cared for over decades, the small collection of spices she kept for her own use, the notebook where she had written down recipe modifications and menu ideas that no one would ever see, and walked out of the mansion into the San Francisco night, carrying nothing but her wounded dignity and the terrible knowledge that sometimes truth was less powerful than convenience. That 15 years of faithful service could be erased in a single evening when someone else's reputation required a sacrifice. The silence that followed Rosa's departure settled over the Caldwell mansion like fog rolling in from the bay, at first barely noticeable, then gradually pervasive, finally becoming an inescapable presence that changed everything it touched. The house continued to function with its usual mechanical efficiency. Madison continued to prepare technically proficient meals. The family continued to gather for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But something essential had vanished, leaving behind a hollow echo where warmth had once existed. Eleanor was the first to notice, though she would never admit it directly. Her morning routine remained unchanged, the same expensive coffee beans, the same Egyptian cotton napkins, the same bone china that had belonged to her grandmother. But her breakfast tasted different. Madison's perfectly poached eggs achieved the right texture, her hollandaise maintained the proper consistency, her sourdough toast was cut to precise specifications. Yet Eleanor found herself pushing food around her plate, eating mechanically while scrolling through her phone, feeling unsatisfied despite having consumed adequate nutrition. The children's responses were more obvious but equally unspoken. Margaret, home for a weekend visit, stood in front of the refrigerator with the same confused expression Samuel had worn weeks earlier, opening and closing the door as if the right food might materialize through persistence. The elaborate leftovers from Madison's latest creation sat untouched in glass containers, visually appealing but somehow uninviting, lacking the mysterious quality that had made Rose's leftovers disappear within hours of being stored. James began eating out more frequently, claiming his busy MBA schedule required grabbing meals between classes and study sessions. But Rosa would have recognized the truth, that he was unconsciously seeking something Madison's sophisticated cooking couldn't provide, something that had to do with comfort rather than technique, with satisfaction that went deeper than merely sophisticated flavors. Samuel's visits home became shorter and less frequent, his explanations focusing on his demanding restaurant schedule, but his eyes revealing a different truth. The kitchen that had been his sanctuary, his classroom, his connection to something authentic in a house full of performance, no longer welcomed him with familiar aromas and patient teaching. Madison's domain was professionally impressive, but emotionally sterile, a workspace rather than a heart. Richard himself began exhibiting signs of restlessness that he couldn't quite identify. His business dinners, once showcases for his household's sophisticated entertaining, became less frequent as he found himself making excuses to meet at restaurants instead. The mansion's formal dining room, which had hosted countless successful evenings under Rose's invisible orchestration, now felt uncomfortable and cold despite Madison's technically superior presentations. The staff dinners revealed the change most clearly. Where Rosa had prepared simple but satisfying meals that brought the household employees together in genuine appreciation, Madison's staff offerings were afterthoughts, assembled from expensive ingredients, but lacking any consideration for the people who would consume them. The cleaning crew began bringing their own lunches. The gardening staff started eating at the diner down the hill. The house that had once felt alive with the rhythm of shared meals fell into the mechanical routine of people who happened to eat in the same location, but no longer shared genuine nourishment. But perhaps the most telling change appeared in the mansion's atmosphere during evening hours. Rose's cooking had possessed a quality that extended far beyond the dining room. The way aromas drifted through hallways, creating anticipation for dinner, the way kitchen sounds provided a comforting background rhythm to the house's daily activities, the way her quiet presence had anchored the household's emotional weather. Without those sensory connections, the mansion felt larger and emptier, its expensive furnishings unable to compensate for the missing warmth that had once made it feel like a home. Madison remained oblivious to the change, focused on perfecting her techniques and planning increasingly elaborate presentations that would establish her reputation in San Francisco's competitive culinary scene. She interpreted the family's decreased enthusiasm as sophistication rather than disappointment, assuming that their muted responses indicated appreciation too refined for obvious praise. Her Instagram account filled with photographs of her creations, each one more visually striking than Rose's humble presentations had ever been, yet none generating the genuine satisfaction that had once filled the mansion's dining spaces. The breaking point came during Eleanor's annual Christmas tea, a tradition that had become legendary among her social circle for its warmth and authenticity. For 15 years, Rosa had prepared for this event with the care of someone creating a masterpiece, developing a menu that balanced elegance with comfort, sophistication with genuine hospitality. Her tamales had become the party's signature offering. Her hot chocolate recipe was requested by guests throughout the year. Her Christmas cookies were so beloved that Eleanor's friends would call in December to confirm they would be served. Madison approached the event with characteristic confidence, planning a contemporary interpretation of traditional holiday flavors that would showcase her modernist techniques. Her tamales were deconstructed, the masa transformed into delicate tuiles topped with precision-cut proteins. Her hot chocolate became a series of temperature-controlled preparations served in laboratory-grade glassware. Her cookies were geometrically perfect, each one identical to the last, beautiful but sterile. The tea party proceeded with appropriate social courtesy, guests offering polite compliments and taking photographs for their own social media accounts. But the warmth that had defined previous years was absent, replaced by the kind of intellectual appreciation that quickly fades once the initial novelty wears off. Eleanor found herself making excuses for elements of the menu that had never required explanation when Rosa was cooking, working harder to maintain conversation that had once flowed naturally around shared appreciation for genuinely satisfying food. After the last guest departed, Eleanor stood in her kitchen watching Madison clean her modernist equipment with the same mechanical precision she brought to cooking. The space felt cold and professional, despite the expensive warming lights Richard had installed, lacking the indefinable quality that had once made even cleanup feel like a continuation of hospitality rather than merely necessary work. That night, alone in her bedroom while Richard worked late in his home office, Eleanor found herself remembering Christmas teas from years past, the way Rosa's tamales had made guests linger longer than planned, the way her hot chocolate had sparked conversations about childhood memories and family traditions, the way people had gathered in the kitchen to watch Rosa work, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized as authentic love made visible through food. For the first time since Rosa's departure, Eleanor allowed herself to acknowledge what they had lost, not just a cook, but the person who had understood that feeding people was about more than nutrition, more than technique, more than even taste. Rosa had possessed the rare ability to create connection through food, to make a house feel like a home, to transform a meal into a memory worth treasuring. The silence settled deeper into the mansion's bones as winter gave way to spring, carried in every efficiently prepared breakfast that satisfied hunger without bringing joy, every technically perfect dinner that left diners somehow empty despite adequate calories, every special occasion that passed without creating the kind of warm memories that had once defined the Caldwell family's gatherings. The house had become like Richard's restaurants, impressive, successful, professionally managed, but lacking the indefinable quality that distinguished mere feeding from genuine nourishment of both body and soul. The truth emerged like dawn breaking over San Francisco Bay, slowly at first, then with sudden, undeniable clarity that changed everything it illuminated. It began with a small inconsistency that Samuel noticed during one of his rare visits home, a detail so minor that anyone less familiar with the kitchen's recent history might have overlooked it completely. Samuel had arrived late on a Thursday evening, exhausted from a double shift at the restaurant where he was building his own culinary reputation. The house was quiet, Madison having left hours earlier after preparing elaborate meals that the family would reheat individually according to their separate schedules. In the refrigerator, he found the usual array of geometrically perfect leftovers, but something else caught his attention. A container labeled with Madison's precise handwriting that contained seafood that clearly predated the night of the disastrous dinner party. The container held lobster shells and fish bones from what appeared to be practice runs of Madison's ill-fated Ciopino course, dated a full week before the charity event that had destroyed Rosa's reputation. Samuel's restaurant experience had taught him to read the signs of spoilage, and these shells showed clear evidence of deterioration that would have made them unsafe to use for stock or any other culinary purpose well before the night Madison claimed Rosa had contaminated the ingredients. Samuel's discovery led him to a more systematic investigation of the kitchen, examining areas that Madison had claimed as her exclusive domain during the weeks leading up to the dinner party. Behind the expensive equipment, in corners that Rosa would never have left uncleaned, but Madison's formal training had overlooked, he found additional evidence: expired ingredients that had been used in preparation, temperature logs that showed the seafood storage had been inadequately maintained, notes in Madison's handwriting that revealed her awareness of problems she had chosen to ignore rather than postpone her showcase dinner. The picture that emerged was devastating in its clarity. Madison had known the seafood was compromised before beginning her preparation, had attempted to mask the problems through elaborate presentation and strong flavors, and had deliberately chosen to serve food she knew was potentially dangerous rather than admit failure in front of Richard's influential guests. When the inevitable consequences materialized, she had calculatingly shifted blame to Rosa, exploiting every prejudice about class and culture that would make her accusation believable to people who had never truly seen Rosa's expertise. Samuel confronted Madison the following morning, presenting the evidence he had discovered with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned to control anger through professional kitchen discipline. Madison's initial response was aggressive denial, then shifting justifications that gradually revealed the depth of her deception. She claimed the compromised ingredients were Rosa's responsibility to monitor, despite having explicitly barred Rosa from accessing her preparation areas. She blamed inadequate kitchen systems that she herself had installed and managed. Finally, faced with undeniable proof of her negligence and dishonesty, she fell back on the defense that had served her from the beginning, that Rosa's presence in the kitchen had somehow created an atmosphere of contamination that made proper food safety impossible. But Samuel was no longer willing to accept explanations that required Rosa to be responsible for Madison's professional failures. His years of working in high-end restaurants had taught him to recognize both competence and its absence, and Madison's elegant presentations could no longer disguise her fundamental lack of understanding about the responsibilities that came with cooking for others. Her formal credentials, which had impressed his parents, meant nothing when compared to Rosa's genuine mastery of the craft. The confrontation escalated when Samuel demanded that Madison publicly admit her responsibility for the food poisoning incident and Rosa's wrongful termination. Madison refused, claiming that her reputation couldn't survive such an admission, that the competitive San Francisco culinary scene would destroy her career if she acknowledged such a fundamental failure of food safety. Her concern for her own professional survival, rather than for the woman whose life she had devastated through false accusations, revealed the essential selfishness that had driven her actions from the beginning. Samuel realized that confronting Madison privately would never result in justice for Rosa or acknowledgement of the truth. Madison had too much invested in her version of events, too much to lose from admitting her culinary negligence and moral cowardice. The only way to restore Rosa's reputation would be to present the evidence to his family, forcing them to confront their own complicity and accepting convenient lies rather than investigating uncomfortable truths. That evening, Samuel gathered his family in the same dining room where Madison's disastrous charity dinner had begun, spreading the evidence across the mahogany table like exhibits in a trial. The expired ingredients, the temperature logs, Madison's own notes acknowledging problems she had chosen to ignore, all of it painted an undeniable picture of professional negligence and deliberate deception that had destroyed an innocent woman's life to protect a guilty one's career. Richard's response revealed the depth of his own moral failing, even faced with clear evidence of Madison's responsibility. His first concern was for the family's social reputation, for how the revelation of his poor judgment in hiring and believing Madison would affect his standing in San Francisco's elite circles. He worried about having to admit to his influential friends that he had wrongfully accused a faithful employee, about the implications for his restaurant empire's reputation for quality and integrity. Eleanor's reaction was more complex, mixing genuine remorse with defensive anger at being forced to confront her own prejudices. She had accepted Madison's attractive presentation of competence over Rosa's authentic but uncredentialed skill, had believed accusations against Rosa, partly because they confirmed her existing assumptions about the superiority of formal education over traditional knowledge. Facing the truth meant acknowledging not just an error in judgment, but a fundamental failure of character that had allowed her to participate in destroying someone who had served her faithfully for 15 years. Margaret and James initially resisted accepting the evidence, their reluctance driven partly by genuine shock, but mostly by unwillingness to admit their own complicity in Rosa's dismissal. They had joined their parents in accepting Madison's version of events because it was easier than questioning their own assumptions about whose word deserved belief, whose expertise deserved respect, whose reputation deserved protection when conflicts arose. But Samuel's presentation was methodical and undeniable, each piece of evidence building toward a conclusion that became impossible to deflect or rationalize away. Madison had committed professional negligence by using ingredients she knew were compromised. She had endangered the health of innocent people through her refusal to acknowledge her mistakes. Most damningly, she had deliberately destroyed Rosa's reputation through false accusations designed to protect her own career, showing a callousness that revealed the true content of her character. The family's discussion continued late into the night, cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and finally grudging acceptance of the truth they could no longer avoid. Madison's sophisticated techniques and impressive credentials couldn't erase her moral failure. Rosa's quiet dignity and uncredentialed skill couldn't be diminished by false accusations. The justice they owed Rosa wasn't complicated by questions of evidence or interpretation. It was simply a matter of having the courage to admit they had been wrong and the integrity to make whatever amends were possible. The next morning, Richard made the call that should have been made months earlier, terminating Madison's employment immediately and without recommendation. But that bitter satisfaction could not undo the months of humiliation Rosa had endured. The loss of income that had forced her to find work wherever she could, the damage to her reputation within San Francisco's domestic worker community that would follow her regardless of eventual vindication. The truth had emerged, clear and undeniable, but truth alone could not restore what had been lost through months of injustice. Rosa's vindication would require more than acknowledgement. It would require the family to find the courage to seek her forgiveness and the wisdom to understand that some wounds, though they might heal, would always leave scars that served as reminders of how easily good people could be sacrificed to protect the comfortable assumptions of those with power. Finding Rosa proved more difficult than Richard had anticipated, a humbling reminder of how completely they had allowed her to become invisible during her years of faithful service. The employment agency that had originally connected them had no current contact information. Rosa had never needed to update her details because she had never planned to leave the Caldwell family service voluntarily. Her old apartment in the Mission District had been rented to new tenants who had never heard of the quiet Mexican woman who had lived there for over a decade. Samuel became the family's detective, using connections from his restaurant work to trace Rosa through San Francisco's network of domestic workers and food service employees. The search took weeks, leading him through a community of hard-working people who protected each other's privacy with the instinctive caution of those who understood how easily their livelihoods could disappear. Finally, a line cook at one of his supplier restaurants mentioned seeing someone matching Rosa's description at a community center in the Excelsior district, preparing meals for a senior nutrition program. The community center occupied a converted warehouse that served the neighborhood's predominantly Latino population, with everything from English classes to job placement services. Samuel found Rosa in the kitchen, wearing a hairnet over her graying hair and the same blue apron she had worn for 15 years in his family's mansion, preparing hundreds of meals with the same care and attention she had lavished on dinners for 12. Her hands moved with the familiar precision he remembered from childhood afternoons spent watching her work, but her face carried new lines of exhaustion and concern that spoke of the months of uncertainty she had endured since being wrongfully terminated. She looked up when Samuel entered the kitchen, her expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and finally resignation. She had developed the protective distance of someone who had learned that even positive encounters could lead to disappointment, that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford without careful consideration of its cost. "Hello, Samuel," she said quietly in English, then switched to Spanish to ask if his family needed something from her. The question carried layers of meaning, wondering if they had come to ask for recipes they had never bothered to write down, to request her services for some special occasion, to seek her help now that Madison's inadequacy had become undeniable. But not once did her tone suggest expectation of apology or acknowledgement of the injustice she had suffered. Samuel's explanation came in halting sentences, interrupted by emotion he had not expected to feel so powerfully. He told her about his discovery of the evidence, about confronting Madison, about his family's grudging acceptance of the truth they should never have needed proof to believe. Rosa listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing of whatever she felt about this vindication that came too late to prevent months of hardship and humiliation. When Samuel finished speaking, Rosa was quiet for a long moment, continuing to stir the large pot of soup that would feed hungry seniors, regardless of whatever personal drama had brought the youngest Caldwell son to her current workplace. Finally, she looked at him with eyes that held a sadness too deep for anger. "I know you didn't believe the lies," she said simply, "but knowing the truth doesn't undo the consequences of the lies. I lost my job, my home, my savings trying to survive while looking for work. I had to move in with my cousin Maria, sleeping on her couch because I couldn't afford rent. At my age, with no references because your father fired me for something I didn't do. Do you know how hard it is to find decent work?" Her words carried weight that Samuel's privileged upbringing had never prepared him to understand. He had imagined that discovering the truth and confronting Madison would somehow restore Rosa's life to what it had been before. But Rosa was explaining a reality where injustice had consequences that extended far beyond reputation. Her dismissal had created a cascade of practical problems: lost income, housing instability, damaged relationships with other potential employers who might have heard rumors about her supposed unreliability. "Your father wants to apologize," Samuel offered, though the words sounded inadequate even to him. "The family wants to make this right, to offer you your job back, to provide references for whatever you choose to do next." Rosa continued stirring her soup, the rhythm of her spoon against the pot marking time, while she considered Samuel's words. When she spoke again, her voice carried the firmness of someone who had spent months thinking through exactly this scenario. "I can't go back to working for people who could believe such things about me after 15 years, she said. "Not because I hold grudges, but because I can't trust them to see me clearly next time someone needs a scapegoat. Your parents believed Madison because she looked like what they thought competence should look like. They believed her accusations because they fit with assumptions they had about people like me. Apologies don't change the kind of people they are." Samuel felt the justice of her response like cold water, recognizing truths about his family that he had been reluctant to acknowledge even to himself. His parents' willingness to believe the worst about Rosa hadn't emerged from nowhere. It had grown from years of subtle prejudices, casual dismissals, the daily disrespect that had trained them to see her as less credible, less valuable, more disposable than someone with Madison's credentials and presentation. "But I do want to thank your father for one thing," Rosa continued, surprising Samuel with an unexpected shift in her tone. "Being fired forced me to leave a situation I should have left years ago. I was comfortable there. Even though I wasn't happy, I was surviving, even though I wasn't thriving. Sometimes it takes losing what you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need." She gestured around the community center kitchen with genuine pride. "Here, I cook for people who appreciate what I do, who understand that feeding others is honor, not service. I make less money, but I make a difference. I feed people who are hungry, not people who are bored with their abundance." Samuel looked around the humble kitchen, noting the second-hand equipment and worn surfaces that Rosa had somehow made warm and welcoming. Despite its modest resources, the space felt alive in a way his family's expensive kitchen had never managed, filled with purposeful activity and genuine appreciation rather than mere function. Would you consider seeing them? Samuel asked finally. Not to accept their apology or to make them feel better about what they did, but to help them understand what they cost you, to help them see you as the person you've always been, instead of the convenient fiction they created to make their mistakes more comfortable. Rosa was quiet for another long moment, her attention apparently focused entirely on seasoning the soup to the precise level of flavor that years of experience had taught her to achieve without tasting. But Samuel recognized the concentration as thinking space, the same expression she had worn when he was a child, asking questions that deserved thoughtful rather than quick answers. I'll see them, she agreed finally, but here in my kitchen, where they can see what I chose to do after they threw me away. If they want to apologize, they can do it while I continue to do work that matters, while I feed people who need feeding rather than people who need impressing. Samuel nodded, understanding that Rosa was offering his family something they didn't deserve, not forgiveness, but the opportunity to witness her dignity, her resilience, her refusal to be diminished by their failure to see her clearly. The reunion would happen on her terms, in her space, where her worth would be obvious even to people who had spent 15 years learning how to overlook it. The meeting would not restore what had been lost, but it might provide something almost as valuable, the chance for Rosa to be seen, really seen, by people who had looked at her every day for 15 years without ever recognizing what they were looking at. And perhaps, Samuel thought, that recognition would be worth more than any apology they could offer, any restitution they could provide, any explanation they could attempt for having failed so completely in the simple human task of seeing the worth in someone who had devoted her life to caring for them. The reunion took place on a Thursday afternoon when the community center kitchen hummed with purposeful activity. Volunteers chopping vegetables for evening meals, Rosa orchestrating multiple dishes simultaneously, seniors beginning to arrive for the lunch program that brought dignity and nourishment to those who might otherwise eat alone or go hungry. Richard and Eleanor arrived in their Tesla, their expensive clothing and obvious discomfort marking them immediately as outsiders in a space where authenticity mattered more than presentation. Rosa greeted them with polite formality, her manner neither hostile nor welcoming, but professionally courteous in the way she had perfected through years of serving people who had never bothered to learn how to treat her with genuine respect. She wore the same blue apron that had been her uniform in their mansion, but now it carried the sense of meals prepared for appreciation rather than obligation, flavors that spoke of love rather than mere sustenance. "Thank you for agreeing to see us," Richard began, his businessman's confidence faltering in this environment where his wealth and influence carried no weight. He had prepared remarks during the drive over, apologies crafted with the same precision he brought to business presentations, but facing Rosa in her chosen domain made his carefully rehearsed words sound hollow and inadequate. Rosa nodded acknowledgement but continued her work, her hands kneading masa for the afternoon's tamales, with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. The rhythm of her labor provided a counterpoint to the conversation, a reminder that her life had continued, past the crisis his family had created, that she had rebuilt her purpose and dignity without waiting for their recognition or approval. Eleanor stood awkwardly beside her husband, clearly uncomfortable in the humble surroundings, but making an effort to appreciate the efficiency and warmth Rosa had created in this simple space. The community center kitchen possessed none of the expensive equipment from the Caldwell mansion, but it functioned with a harmony and purpose that their elaborate setup had never achieved. Animated by Rosa's understanding of cooking as service rather than performance. "We discovered evidence that Madison was responsible for the food poisoning," Richard announced, producing documentation as if he were presenting a business proposal rather than acknowledging devastating personal failure. "We know now that you were wrongfully accused, that we made a terrible mistake in our judgment." Rosa accepted the papers but didn't examine them, setting them aside with no more ceremony than she would give to a grocery receipt. "I already knew I was innocent," she replied matter-of-factly. "I never needed proof of what I hadn't done. The question was whether you would ever care enough to discover the truth." Her response carried quiet power, that left Richard speechless. He had expected gratitude for his investigation, appreciation for his willingness to confront uncomfortable facts, some acknowledgement that vindication was meaningful regardless of how long it had taken to arrive. But Rosa was explaining that truth had never been the issue. The issue had been their failure to trust 15 years of demonstrated integrity over the convenient accusations of a stranger whose credentials appealed to their prejudices. Samuel, who had accompanied his parents as both translator and moral support, watched his father struggle with the realization that vindication wasn't forgiveness, that proof of innocence didn't erase the consequences of having been presumed guilty. Rosa's calm acceptance of their belated acknowledgement somehow made their failure seem even more profound than angry accusations would have accomplished. "We want to make this right," Eleanor interjected, her voice carrying the strain of someone unused to occupying the position of supplicant. "We'd like to offer you your position back, with a raise, with better working conditions. We realize now how valuable you were to our family, how much we lost when we let you go." Rosa smiled for the first time during the conversation, but it wasn't a happy expression. "You want to make yourselves feel better," she corrected gently. "You want to restore your comfort by putting things back the way they were, by pretending the last few months were just a temporary mistake rather than a revelation of who you really are." She gestured around the community center kitchen where volunteers of various ages worked alongside her, where seniors gathered in anticipation of meals prepared with consideration for their health needs and cultural preferences, where cooking was treated as essential community service rather than invisible domestic labor. "I can't go back to being the person who made your family comfortable while staying invisible myself," Rosa continued. "I'm too old to pretend that 15 years of being taken for granted was actually appreciation, that casual disrespect was actually kindness, that being fired for something I didn't do was actually just a regrettable misunderstanding." Richard's businessman instincts prompted him to negotiate, to increase the offer until it became irresistible. "We could double your salary," he suggested desperately. "We could provide full benefits, vacation time, recognition for everything you contributed to our household. We could give you references that would open doors anywhere you wanted to work." But Rosa was already shaking her head, not in anger, but with the patient firmness of someone who had thought through these possibilities during long nights when uncertainty about her future had kept her awake. "Money can't buy back trust," she explained. "Benefits can't restore dignity. References can't undo the months I spent wondering if anyone would ever believe in my integrity again." Instead, she continued working, her hands shaping masa into perfect circles that would become vessels for fillings that combined traditional flavors with nutritional requirements for the seniors who depended on her meals. The tamales she was preparing were simpler than the elaborate versions she had made for Caldwell dinner parties, but they carried more meaning because they fed genuine need rather than social obligation. "But I don't hold grudges," Rosa added, surprising them with the grace that had sustained her through years of unacknowledged service. "I understand that people make mistakes, that fear can make us cruel, that sometimes we hurt others without meaning to cause harm. I forgive you, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger would make me smaller than I choose to be." Her forgiveness hit harder than any accusation could have, revealing the depth of character that their assumptions had prevented them from recognizing during her years of faithful service. Rosa was demonstrating the strength it took to respond to injustice with dignity, to choose grace over resentment, to offer redemption to people who had failed to offer her basic respect. Eleanor began crying quietly, finally understanding the magnitude of what they had lost when they chose to believe comfortable lies rather than investigate uncomfortable truths. Not just a cook, but a person of extraordinary character who had nourished their family with more than food, who had provided stability and care and quiet wisdom that their wealth could never replace. Samuel stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion he had been holding back throughout the confrontation with his family's moral failure. "What can we do?" he asked. "Not to make this right because we can't undo what we did to you, but to honor what you taught us, to make sure your example means something." Rosa considered his question while adding seasoning to her masa, tasting and adjusting with the precision of someone whose palate had been educated through decades of patient practice. When she answered, her suggestion revealed both practical wisdom and generous spirit. "Support this place," she said simply. "This community center feeds people who are hungry, teaches people who want to learn, provides services for people who can't afford to pay. Your family has resources that could make a real difference here, could help us serve more people, could turn your guilt into something useful." The proposal offered them exactly what they needed, a way to transform their remorse into positive action, to honor Rosa's character by supporting work that mattered to her. Not punishment disguised as charity, but genuine opportunity to contribute to something larger than their own comfort, to align their actions with the values Rosa had demonstrated rather than the prejudices they had revealed. Richard nodded immediately, already calculating the financial support they could provide, the connections they could make available, the ways their business success could serve Rosa's chosen mission. Eleanor began asking practical questions about the center's needs, her organizational skills, finding purpose in supporting work that fed souls as well as bodies. But Rosa had one final lesson to offer, delivered with the same quiet authority she had brought to teaching Samuel about cooking during his teenage years. "Remember that everyone who serves you is a person with dignity, with skills, with stories worth knowing. Remember that the people who feed you, who clean for you, who care for you, are not invisible just because you pay them to be helpful." She handed Eleanor a fresh tamale, still warm from the steamer, prepared with the same care Rosa had brought to thousands of meals in their mansion, but now offered as gift rather than obligation. "Taste this," she suggested. "Really taste it, not to judge whether it's sophisticated enough for your dinner parties, but to understand what it means to cook with love." Eleanor bit into the tamale, her face changing as she experienced flavors she had eaten hundreds of times without truly tasting. The masa, perfectly seasoned and textured, the filling bright with chilies and cumin, and the kind of depth that came from allowing time to work its slow magic, the corn husk that had imparted subtle sweetness during steaming. For 15 years, Rosa had been preparing food exactly this good, and Eleanor was tasting it clearly for the first time. The tears came harder now, grief for all the meals she had consumed without appreciation, all the opportunities she had missed to acknowledge Rosa's artistry, all the moments when simple gratitude could have transformed employer-employee transaction into human connection. She was tasting not just Rosa's cooking, but her own blindness, understanding finally what they had lost when they chose comfortable prejudices over uncomfortable truth. The reunion ended quietly, without dramatic reconciliation or promises that couldn't be kept, but with something more valuable, genuine recognition that transcended apology. Rosa had been seen, finally and completely, by people who had looked at her every day for 15 years without recognizing her worth. That recognition couldn't undo the injustice, but it could honor her dignity and transform their understanding of what it meant to serve others with integrity. As they prepared to leave, Samuel hung back for a moment, wanting to express gratitude that went beyond his family's collective apology. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for forgiving us, but for teaching me what cooking really means, what service really means, what dignity really looks like." Rosa smiled, this time with genuine warmth. "Cook with your heart, mijo," she replied, using the endearment that had always come naturally, despite the formal boundaries their circumstances had imposed. "Feed people because you love them, not because they pay you. That's the only lesson that matters." Samuel nodded, carrying those words back to his own restaurant kitchen, where he would spend the rest of his career trying to live up to the example Rosa had set, trying to honor the teacher who had shown him that the highest form of cooking was love made visible through patient, skilled, generous service to others. 2 years passed like seasons changing over San Francisco Bay, bringing transformation that grew quietly from seeds planted during that humble reunion in the community center kitchen. Rosa's life bloomed in ways she never could have imagined during her years of invisible service, expanding beyond the boundaries that others had set for her possibilities, toward recognition that honored both her heritage and her extraordinary gifts. The community center became a beacon in the Excelsior district, its programs expanding with the generous support that Richard and Eleanor provided, not as penance, but as investment in their evolving understanding of what wealth should accomplish. Rosa's kitchen grew from a simple meal preparation space into a culinary training center, where immigrant women learned skills that could support their families, where traditional recipes were preserved and passed down, where food became a bridge connecting cultures and generations. Samuel kept his promise to cook with heart, building his reputation in San Francisco's competitive restaurant scene while never forgetting the lessons Rosa had taught him about the difference between feeding and nourishing. His restaurant, when he finally opened it, featured a wall dedicated to home cooks who had influenced professional chefs. Rosa's photograph held the place of honor, accompanied by a plaque that read, "To the teachers who cook with love," in both English and Spanish. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A food writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, researching a story about influential home cooks in the city's private households, had encountered multiple references to Rosa's legendary skills from restaurant workers who remembered meals she had prepared for special occasions, from catering staff who had tried unsuccessfully to replicate her techniques, from families who still measured other cooks against standards she had set during her years of invisible excellence. The resulting article, titled "The Hidden Masters: Honoring the Immigrant Women Who Shaped Our City's Palate," featured Rosa prominently alongside other domestic cooks whose influence had spread far beyond their official recognition. The piece described her 15 years of service to one of San Francisco's most prominent families, her wrongful termination and eventual vindication, her current work at the community center, and her role in preserving and sharing culinary traditions that might otherwise be lost to assimilation and generational change. The attention brought Rosa opportunities she had never sought but embraced with characteristic grace. Food Network invited her to compete on a show celebrating home cooks, where her traditional techniques and intuitive understanding of flavor relationships impressed judges and viewers alike. She didn't win the competition, but her appearances generated enough interest to lead to a cookbook deal that would document her recipes alongside the stories of the women who had passed them down through generations. Cooking from the Heart: Recipes and Memories from a Mexican Kitchen became more than a cookbook. It became a celebration of immigrant culture, a recognition of the expertise that existed outside formal culinary education, an acknowledgement that the women who had fed America's families for generations deserved to have their contributions recorded and honored. Rosa's recipes were presented alongside photographs of her grandmother's kitchen in Guadalajara, stories of family celebrations that had shaped her understanding of food as love, reflections on the dignity that comes from serving others with skill and generous spirit. The cookbook's success led to other recognitions that Rosa accepted with bemused gratitude. The James Beard Foundation honored her with a Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing her contributions to preserving Mexican culinary traditions and mentoring young cooks. The mayor of San Francisco proclaimed a day in her honor, celebrating not just her individual achievements, but the contributions of all immigrant women who had enriched the city's food culture through their skills and dedication. But perhaps the recognition that meant most to Rosa came from an unexpected source. Margaret Caldwell, now running a division of her father's restaurant empire, who reached out to request Rosa's consultation on a new concept that would honor traditional Mexican cooking techniques while providing living wages and recognition for the immigrant women who possessed these skills. The project became Abuela's Kitchen, a restaurant collective where experienced home cooks like Rosa could share their expertise while building their own businesses, where traditional recipes could be presented with the respect they deserved, where customers could understand that they were not just consuming food, but participating in cultural preservation and recognition. Rosa agreed to serve as the project's culinary director, bringing together women whose skills had been developed in home kitchens, but whose knowledge rivaled that of any professionally trained chef. The collective became a model for how traditional food knowledge could be valued and compensated fairly, how immigrant women could transition from invisible domestic work to recognized culinary leadership. On the evening of Abuela's Kitchen's grand opening, Rosa stood in the dining room that buzzed with appreciative conversation about flavors that told stories, techniques that honored heritage, food that satisfied souls as well as stomachs. Samuel was there, proud of the teacher who had shaped his understanding of what cooking could accomplish. Richard and Eleanor were there too, no longer employers but supporters who had learned to recognize worth that went beyond their initial narrow vision. The menu featured dishes Rosa had perfected during her years of invisible service, the mole that required 3 days of patient preparation, the tamales that carried 4 generations of accumulated wisdom, the simple rice and beans that became extraordinary through understanding and care. But now these dishes were presented with full credit to their creators, with stories that honored the women who had preserved these traditions, with prices that recognized the skill required to achieve such depth and complexity of flavor. As Rosa watched diners savor food, she'd prepared for recognition rather than invisibility. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain of being wrongfully accused had been real. The months of uncertainty and financial hardship had tested her resilience in ways she wouldn't wish on anyone. But that crisis had also freed her from accepting less than she deserved, had forced her to discover possibilities she had been too comfortable to pursue, had ultimately led her to recognition that honored her heritage while creating opportunities for other women like herself. A young woman approached Rosa's table, introducing herself as a culinary school student who wanted to thank her for demonstrating that expertise came in many forms, that formal education wasn't the only path to mastery, that traditional knowledge deserved respect and preservation. Rosa smiled and invited the student to visit the community center kitchen to learn techniques that couldn't be taught in classrooms, to understand that the highest form of cooking was service to others. The evening concluded with toasts recognizing Rosa's contributions, not just to cooking, but to expanding understanding of what expertise looked like, what dignity meant, what recognition required. Samuel raised his glass with words that captured something essential about the teacher who had shaped his understanding of both cooking and character. To Rosa Martinez, who taught me that feeding people isn't just about satisfying hunger, but about creating connections, preserving culture, and demonstrating that love is the most important ingredient in any recipe. Rosa accepted the recognition with quiet gratitude, understanding that her individual success was meaningful only if it created opportunities for others, only if it challenged assumptions about whose knowledge deserved respect, whose contributions deserved acknowledgement, whose dignity deserved recognition. She had been invisible for so long that being seen felt like a miracle, but she knew that true success would be measured by whether other invisible women could follow her path from shadows into light. Later that evening, alone in her small apartment that she could now afford without sharing, Rosa called her sister in Mexico to share news of the restaurant's success. She described dishes their grandmother would recognize, techniques their great-grandmother had taught, flavors that carried forward traditions that might otherwise be forgotten. She promised to send money to help her nephew finish school, to bring her sister to visit San Francisco, to ensure that success meant opportunity for family members who had supported her through difficult times. Before sleeping, Rosa touched the molcajete that still sat on her kitchen counter. Worn smooth by generations of women who had understood that grinding spices was both practical necessity and cultural preservation. Tomorrow, she would return to work that honored her skills, that compensated her fairly, that recognized her expertise while allowing her to share knowledge with younger cooks who could carry traditions forward into the future. The girl who had learned to cook by watching her grandmother's hands had become a woman whose own hands created opportunities for others, whose resilience had transformed personal crisis into community benefit, whose dignity had survived injustice to model what strength looked like when seasoned with grace and gratitude. Rosa had found her way from invisibility to recognition, from service that diminished to work that celebrated, from surviving to thriving in ways that honored both her heritage and her extraordinary gifts. And you, have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you, who dismissed your efforts as ordinary while they savored every bite? Have you ever poured your heart into feeding others only to have your contributions treated as invisible, your skills taken for granted, your dedication assumed rather than acknowledged? Rosa's story reminds us that the women who nourish us, in restaurant kitchens and family homes, in school cafeterias and community centers, in the countless places where food is prepared with care, deserve recognition that goes beyond payment, respect that honors their expertise, gratitude that acknowledges the love they put into every meal they create. Tell me in the comments about the cooks in your life who have fed you with more than food, who have shown you what love tastes like, who have created memories through meals that satisfied your soul as well as your body. If this story touched your heart, please share it so Rosa's message can reach other women who cook with their hearts, who serve with dignity, who deserve to be seen for the artists and teachers and nurturers they have always been. Subscribe to hear more stories that honor the unsung heroes in our kitchens, the invisible hands that feed us, the generous hearts that understand cooking is the most honest way to say, I love you. For more heartfelt narratives that celebrate resilience, dignity, and the power of being truly seen, click the podcast link. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until our next story, remember that every meal prepared with love is a gift worth acknowledging. Every cook who nourishes others deserves recognition, and every person who has ever felt invisible for the love they give through food is worthy of being celebrated.